Sometimes the only thing left to do is take action. The bank staff had just forced an elderly man out of the building, but not long after a police officer showed up, bringing him right back in. Joseph was upset and overwhelmed. On top of that, he was scared. He needed to get his money, but no one was helping him. That was what a bank was for, wasn't it? To give you access to your own money. How could they just tell him there was nothing they could do? He needed that cash. It didn't make any sense to him that the teller was refusing. At 92, Joseph was shaking with frustration. His wife was counting on him and he couldn't walk through the door empty-handed. The teller tried again to explain that his ID had expired, and without a valid one, they couldn't release any funds. Even though they could clearly see he was the same person in the photo and it had only expired a week ago, rules were rules. Their policy didn't allow exceptions, no matter how small. The teller gently suggested the ATM, hoping it might help. But Joseph didn't trust those machines. He didn't even own a bank card, and without a valid ID, they couldn't give him one. That option was off the table. With each passing moment, he got more flustered and afraid. He felt like he was hitting a wall. His voice was shaking. Tears had started forming in his eyes. Then a manager came over and lightly placed a hand on his shoulder to try and calm things down. But it only made things worse. Joseph snapped. He started yelling and flailing his arms in panic. His stress was clearly boiling over. He kept shouting that it was his money and they couldn't just hold it from him. His voice rose until the whole bank went quiet. The security guard stepped in, holding Joseph firmly by the shoulders. They guided him outside and told him he'd have to return once he had proper ID. To the staff, it looked like he was just overreacting. What they didn't realize was that Joseph was truly desperate. He wasn't being dramatic. He was scared and had every reason to be. Joseph didn't give up. He came back and started banging on the glass doors, shouting to be let in. That's when the bank finally called the police. They weren't trying to get him in trouble. They were just worried. The way things were going, the man could hurt himself if someone didn't step in soon. His anger and fear had reached a point where anything could happen. Officer Caleb happened to be nearby when the call came through. His shift was almost over, but when he heard it involved an elderly man in distress, he figured he'd stop by. He'd been on duty all night and was ready to head home, but he was closest to the scene and figured he could handle it calmly. He just hoped the old man would be open to that. Caleb accepted the call and drove to the bank as quickly as he could. What he saw when he arrived caught him off guard. There was an older man banging his fist gently against the glass doors, his face flushed and wet with tears. He was pleading for them to let him in. The whole thing was tough to watch. Caleb knew he had to tread carefully. The man looked so worked up he worried he might have a stroke. His top priority now was to calm him down and figure out what was really going on. When the man saw Caleb, he turned right to him and began explaining that the bank was refusing to give him his money. He said they were holding on to funds he'd spent a lifetime earning. Caleb knew he'd need to hear the whole story, but first he needed to get the man away from the front of the bank. He asked for his name and gently suggested grabbing a cup of coffee at the diner across the street. Why was the man so desperate to get money that morning? Caleb was stunned when Joseph explained. He had no cash left, and without a bank card, there was no way to buy anything. If the bank didn't help him, he couldn't even afford food for himself or his wife, and then it got even harder to hear. Joseph wasn't just running low on cash. He was terrified, because if he couldn't get that money, he might lose the most important person in his life, his wife. She was very sick and needed medication, but without money, he couldn't buy it. Joseph blamed himself. He was 94, but still sharp, still usually on top of things. He always made sure they had extra cash and enough medicine, but he'd been sick the past couple of weeks too, and everything had fallen apart. He hadn't been able to leave the house. They had a nurse who visited once a week, but no one else to help with the basics. They never had kids, and their family lived far away. With his wife in that condition, Joseph felt like everything was resting on him. Joseph usually handled the errands himself. He went to the bank, did the grocery shopping, and always made sure to pick up his wife's medicine. But the past few weeks, he'd been down with a terrible flu and couldn't manage any of it. Now they only had enough medicine left for that morning. If he didn't get cash today, she'd go without, something that could be dangerous. On top of that, they were also out of food. Even though he was still weak from being sick, Joseph had pushed himself to get up and take care of things. He gathered what little energy he had and made his way to the bank, only to be told he couldn't get his money because his ID card had expired just a week ago. He hadn't even realized. With everything else going on, it had completely slipped his mind. He couldn't understand why they couldn't just make an exception. He still looked the same. It was still clearly him. He didn't have a driver's license either. His eyesight had gotten too bad to drive, so he'd been using the bus for a while now. That license had expired over a year ago. Joseph had already been through more than most people could imagine in the past year. It made sense that he was feeling completely overwhelmed. Watching his wife get worse every day was painful enough. He was doing everything he could to care for her, but now it felt like he was falling short. For someone like Joseph, that was crushing. He understood the bank's policy, but that didn't help him in the moment. There was no way he could fix his documents that same day. The office that handled ID renewals was way across town, and getting there by bus would take forever. He wouldn't be back in time to buy groceries or her medicine. Joseph stared into his coffee and lowered his head, trying to blink away the tears that were quietly forming again. This felt like too much, like the final blow. He felt like he had nothing left to give. But sometimes, when everything feels lost, someone steps in and changes things. Caleb might have been off the clock, but he knew there was no way he could go home and sleep knowing he didn't try to help. He gently asked Joseph to come with him. First, they went to the police station to grab Caleb's personal car. He was officially off duty for 2 days, which meant he had time, and he was going to use it to help this man. Then the two of them drove off toward the licensing office. Normally, renewing an ID requires an appointment, but wearing the uniform has its perks. Caleb was able to speak directly with a supervisor and explain everything. Once they heard that a 94-year-old man couldn't buy food or medicine without his ID, their tone changed. They agreed to squeeze Joseph in. But there was still some bad news. Joseph wouldn't be getting his new ID card that day. It usually takes 4 to 6 weeks to arrive by mail. However, they were able to issue a temporary one on the spot. Caleb could only hope that it would be enough for the bank. He wasn't sure what their stance was on temporary IDs. Based on how strict they'd been earlier, it wouldn't be surprising if they refused it too, even if it meant letting a long-time customer go hungry. With the temporary ID in hand, they headed straight back to the bank. Caleb glanced at the time. It was one of those days when the bank closed earlier than usual and they were cutting it close. On the way, Joseph shared some stories from his life. Caleb was blown away. The things this man had lived through, the lessons, the quiet strength, it moved him deeply. Joseph had no idea just how much those stories meant. But even with all that, Caleb couldn't help worrying that they might still miss their window. The same man who had been thrown out of the bank just hours earlier was now being escorted back in, this time by a police officer ready to stand by him. When they got there, the doors were already halfway closed. Caleb didn't pause. He hurried inside and pleaded with the staff not to shut everything down just yet. He quickly explained what had happened. Then Joseph stepped forward. Quietly and with real humility, he apologized to the teller he'd yelled at and to the rest of the staff. He said he was deeply sorry. He couldn't remember ever treating anyone like that in his life. Whether they helped him or not, he wanted them to know he regretted how he acted. The bank manager finally stepped in and decided to make an exception. Technically, the bank still had 5 minutes before closing, time they normally use to shut things down, but today they chose to use it to help someone instead. They gave Joseph his cash. And they also set him up with a bank card. He wasn't thrilled about using one, but at least now, if anything like this ever happened again, he'd have a backup. Caleb had already done so much, but he wasn't finished yet. As they walked out of the bank, Joseph turned to him with heartfelt thanks. He hadn't experienced that kind of kindness in a long time. He knew the officer must be exhausted after a full night on duty, but this act of care would stay with him for the rest of his life. Caleb just chuckled and shook his head. He wasn't going anywhere. There was no way he was going to leave the old man now. His only grandfather had passed away the year before, and something about Joseph reminded him of him. He didn't have anywhere to be, and it felt good to spend time doing something that really mattered. First, Caleb took Joseph to the pharmacy to get his wife's medication. Then they headed to the grocery store for some essentials. On the way home, they stopped to pick up some takeout for the couple. It had been a long day, and Caleb figured Joseph wouldn't feel like cooking. It was just a small gesture, but a meaningful one. They didn't usually treat themselves to restaurant food. On a fixed income, every little thing had to be planned out carefully. Medical costs added up, even with a bit of help from the state. Money was tight. His wife hadn't been able to leave the house in weeks, but none of that changed how much she meant to him. Having her there, that was everything. But Joseph had no idea what was waiting for him later. Caleb dropped him off just in time to catch the nurse on her way out. His wife had started to worry when he didn't return earlier, but now she saw him walking in with a kind young officer. She was relieved and grateful. What she and Joseph didn't fully realize until that evening was just how much Caleb had really done for them. Caleb had already gone home to finally get the rest he needed, and the couple had spent the evening together in peace. Later that night, Joseph took out the envelope with the cash he had withdrawn. He wanted to make sure they still had enough to last the month, but what he found left him speechless. He had handed that envelope to Caleb earlier so the officer could pay for the medicine and groceries. It was easier that way since Joseph was exhausted and counting out money was getting hard. Letting someone else handle it had been a relief, but he never expected what he was looking at now. He called to his wife and showed her what he had found. Every single bill was still in the envelope. Caleb hadn't used any of it. The young officer had paid for everything, the food, the medicine, all from his own pocket. Joseph couldn't believe it. It was a blessing bigger than anything he'd hoped for that morning. But it didn't end there. Over the next couple of years, until Joseph and his wife passed, Caleb visited often. He helped with errands, brought over food when he could, and handled the little tasks Joseph could no longer manage. What started as one of the hardest days of Joseph's life ended up becoming one of the most meaningful. Caleb felt like he had grandparents again, and the couple no longer felt forgotten or alone. Sometimes lives are changed just because someone took a moment to care. A little kindness really can go a long way. Isn't that something? Do you judge people when they get angry in public, or do you wonder what might be going on in their life? Let us know what you think in the comments. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more true stories that show just how powerful kindness can be. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.